Welcome back. Welcome back, Gabriela, Jaime, Marqueta, Pamela. Welcome back. I hope you had a really interesting conversation, and I also hope that you got to meet perhaps someone new and connect. Right, this is where the fun stuff happens. Please write down in the chat box or put up your hand or just unmute yourself if you want to say and share some of the conversation that you had, some of the observations. I'm going to take this off so we can all see each other. And actually, I'd invite you to, if you can, perhaps switch on your videos and let's start having the conversation, because this, you've got amazing experience in this room. This is where it starts getting really exciting. Over to you, Mona.
Thank you, Kat. So I was in the group with Sandor from UNEP, and we were talking about what's good for the scooping, what's not. And one of the points we said that it's important to come do the scoping, knowing the topic, maybe even going further, defining the perspective for which area want to do the foresight, and also coming prepared once you define these topics. And it's good to be prepared and stick to that lane of this is the thematic, this is the area, and this is the perspective on which we're doing the foresight. And I mentioned, and I'm sure Minji is here, with the experience we had in Guinea, that honestly, we've been back and forth with the people with the innovation cell just on the topic. Everybody thought, oh, development is more important than political, and then the others political. And then we went one route and we changed our mind in the middle. And it does not help when you want to prepare for a good, robust foresight exercise. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm like putting thumbs up, but I'm seeing that anyway, spot on. We will come to that. I think the value of a soft contract around a scoping note at the end of this stage is really super important, but getting that not too narrow, but also not too broad. It can't do everything. Being very clear about what it can do to kind of create impact and to stop. I think there's that wonderful analogy of like putting all the different baubles on the tree. There's that risk that often comes out. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mona. Engi.
It's Inji.
NG, I apologize. NG, welcome.
No worries.
Please introduce yourself and also where you're from. Thank you.
Okay. I'm head of exploration of Egypt's UNDP Accelerator Lab. The key points that we had in the discussion were mainly, number one, discussing the objective, why we want to do this futures work. Number two was discussing why we like what has been changing in order that called the urge for this futures work. Are we looking for risks mitigation? Are we looking for opportunities? Are we looking for certain objectives? And step number three, who would we like to talk to or to have on the table? Here we mentioned actually two things. Number one, that we need to have diversified people from different backgrounds who are like would affect the future of the thing that we're talking or discussing. But at the same time, we need to make sure if there is any kind of cultural barrier with one of those segments who would be on the table, we need to have this in mind, because sometimes this happened to me personally. We need to separate regionally speaking, like rural versus urban, because combining rural with urban together would make the language much more complicated and would be more of a barrier than of an opportunity. Step number four was talking about the time frame, like when do we want to see the futures? Is it 10 years from now, 20 years, 50 years? To be able to see like what kind of things we want to look at and investigate. That's all.
Fabulous. So let me just pick up on a few of those. So getting into the purpose, understanding why now, or in other words, the burning platform. Why is it could do any kind of futures exercise at any point. Why is it suddenly relevant? And getting underneath that kind of burning platform idea is really, really important. I think very rich conversation that you came out with on stakeholders, both understanding what's in it for them, different them, but also understanding their different needs, because that has a massive implication in the downstream. What are the kind of methods or approaches that you use, how you design the different sequencing of different engagements, and in particular, as well as rural, urban, different regions, different kind of sectors that have their own language and may often find it difficult to engage. So often it's about keeping them more separate to begin with, and then slowly and very thoughtfully bringing in people together and diversifying the groups. There is also something about, I personally find a really key interesting question is people who self-select themselves into groups versus those who are brought in because they represent and they're important for legitimacy. And bringing those two together at the beginning can sometimes be a little bit difficult. So having a lot of thought to that is very important, because otherwise there's quite a big culture clash. And I know in a lot of there's a growing interest in participative foresight exercises and how you do that. And I think that whole kind of self-selection, choosing to be involved versus actually it's important because we need a representative selection of the whole national population, is something to really keep an eye on and worthy of further conversation. But I wanted to come back to a question for you, NG, around time horizons. Did you have any reflections on how to select the right time horizon?
We didn't discuss that, but I can reflect on that now from your question. From a previous exercise I was engaged in, I was doing foresight work on the future of small farmers in Egypt. And if you want to talk about small farmers, it's like you're talking about future is like completely like you're an alien. So choosing the horizon was mainly based on how to make those people talk and express futures without making them feel that you're coming from a completely different planet that would make them struggle more than talk and discuss. So accordingly, the horizon that we chose at that time was like 15 years. Another case that was for like developing or like take part in developing climate change adaptation policy in Egypt. This for this, the time frame was already set. It was going to be for version 2050. So accordingly, the time frame we had for the urban areas was 30 years horizon scope.
Fabulous. And I'll invite everybody else to start adding some comments into the chat box if you can. We'll keep this conversation going for a few more minutes because it's really interesting. A couple of points on time horizons, well, 3. First of all, be quite conscious of the age of the people in the room. If you're talking, I've just talked about nuclear threat initiative with people who set up NTI, for example, 20 years ago. There were a lot of 80-year-old, 90-year-old people in the room. That's very different to working with a bunch of 20-year-olds. That makes a big difference. It's an obvious point, but important to include. But I think the two additional points on time horizon. Stretching out your trends about 5 or 10 years further than the scenarios is really important, because sometimes your system dynamics can mean that a scenario that looks pretty glum in 10 to 15 years, if you start looking at how the system behaves a few years after that, is important to engage. So that's important because obviously trends go backwards and forwards, and sometimes a challenge creates a solution 5 or 10 years down the line. So being quite aware of those dynamics is quite important. I always like to have 3 time horizons, one really far out, so people really let go of their vested interests or who they are in that system. One then about 5 years out, which is as far out as the strategic planning cycle for the organization, so people can kind of see how that then feeds back. And then a time horizon 6 months out that people can kind of say, okay, and what does this mean for me? So holding those at the same time can be quite powerful. Over to you, Pamela, and then I'll go to Gabriella.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I sat with Marketa, and both of us have a coaching background. So we actually focused in on something quite different than perhaps others. We were looking at the communication side of it. And so what we were noticing, what had produced the best result, was the use of more open-ended questions of then following on what the answer had been to that question. Really leading the process gently. And similarly, we were looking at the real focus on a purpose. What's the end use of the exercise? How are you going to use this data? And then building on that as well. But at the same time, introducing things that maybe they hadn't thought about, like what could be the downside of the exercise? Or have you thought about gender? You're in this position, you want to partner with another who's in a different position. How does that impact? And then the other thing that we found with no assumptions, there was no walking into this assuming that this is how it's going to go. It wasn't cooked in that response, I guess is the best way to put it. And then finally, really creating an ownership concept. So by saying to the foreign minister's office representative of, this is something we'd like you to lead. Are you willing to do that? And it puts the stakeholder very firmly into an active role in the process as well. I don't know if Marketa wants to add to that. If I don't think we caught everything, but one of the things I noticed as someone, I'm head of an RC office, but I've done a lot of work with country teams on creating strategic plans. And when they first rolled out the new version of the cooperation framework, the guidelines arrived. I was in Iraq at the time, and the guidelines arrived with really very little relevance to the situation in which we found ourselves. And we all are faced, I think, with being told this is how you have to do something. And so we actually did almost a foresight process with the guidelines to say, what would this mean if we followed this? What would be the impact? Would we get a result that's useful to us? Is it something that reflects our context at all? So we took the bits that worked, we found the areas of flexibility, and we simply disregarded the rest. And we came up with a very, very relevant document as a result. It doesn't always work, but I think this is a concept of assessment that can be used in almost any situation when you're trying to do strategic planning.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, and Pamela, thank you, and really picking up on some of the comments in the chat, that kind of curiosity, those open questions. That's very, very powerful indeed. And thank you also for picking up on that gender point. It's like being both open, but also having had enough research that you know perhaps where to suggest things. And I think this is another frequent question that people have, which is, how normative can you be? To what extent can you actually bring your own concerns and questions into this process? And I think there's something about, again, balancing often the commissioner, the Horizon 1 actors agenda, who has kind of come to the fore, got legacy, past, a track record in this space, with actually your role in getting Horizon 3 actors and Horizon 2 innovators to kind of connect into that. So I think that's the powerful, holding a space, being able to understand and connect to the client's needs, at the same time being able to use that legitimacy, therefore, to bring in those other ideas and those other issues that your analysis has really indicated and your conversations with others have really indicated that are really important. One final intervention from Gabriella, but thank you very much for all the comments in the chat, and keep them coming if you want. What makes for good or bad scoping?
Thank you. Although I think Pamela hit the nail on the head. I was with Jaime from UNFPA, and we kind of focused on some of the active listening tools. Again, from more of a mediation background, we noticed that, if you ask probing questions like "tell me more" to dig deeper, that worked well. Where, if you ask a few questions at the same time, that kind of maybe confuses, or you're leading questions, that's a little less constructive. So I won't continue, but I think Pamela summarized nicely, and everyone else had great ideas as well.
Fabulous. Well, let's continue. And just to kind of put a few more pins in a few things, it's like, for me, I'm always like, what's the burning platform and what's the vehicle for change? What, you know, so many times people are like, I'm going to do this big, massive exercise. I'm going to think about the future, but it's actually to inform a speech. Yeah. Or so it's like, what are the assets that are going to be able to be moved around as a result of this work, and make sure that we kind of know how we can, you know, that vehicle for change, and kind of make sure that you get something that really works for that. I think there's also, and then picking up on Pamela's point around the steering group, or kind of mechanisms, governance mechanisms for making sure that ideas get taken up. This is all your bread and butter, and I'm hoping that it basically helps you connect the dots between lots of things that you're already doing. So thank you very much, and we shall continue on some other 4 learning points, which are, first of all, we heard about the importance of purpose. But let's now think about some other reasons, other things that we need to think about at this stage of scoping. So just want to check, can everybody see my screen? Yeah? Okay, I will continue. So getting into the audience, who's it for? What needs will it satisfy? That's something that Gabriella mentioned. What's the focal question that this whole project goes around? Is it clear? What foresight activities and methods, will really look into that, are you going to use to look at this topic? And can you communicate why you've chosen them easily? And do you have that sensing network to help pick up on what is going on in that open space on the Horizon 2 and Horizon 3? So that is what we're going to be exploring later in the next few minutes. And I know that people are particularly interested in that kind of, you know, how do you organize it, you know, create a question around which the whole project is kind of then refined. So understanding that demand is really important, and most projects will start with the commissioner, with the client's decision and organization at the heart of it, but other people, as we've discussed, really need to be part of that as well. Your project will need the active and willing participation of lots of other people. So understanding the buy-in from the commissioner, but also reaching out to others in that authorizing environment in the way that our case study just identified, different international organizations, different people internally in the organization, in the academic community, in the community that you want to work with, is really important. And understanding why people want to do it, and it'll be for different reasons, will help you start think through who you get involved, what are the process and the methods that you do. So it's really important to understand the demand in the first place, why now, and the route to impact, but also there are different commissioning models that often are behind why you end up with a foresight project on your plate. Sometimes it's from a senior decision maker, it's an organizational request. Sometimes it's because you've identified that there's a really important issue going on and you've actually got the mandate to operate. So it's like you keep on, in your interactions, you keep on spotting that there is that topic that you really want to kind of work on. There's, for example, there's a community that you think are really important to engage with. So that, and sometimes it's a genuinely emergent project, but participating, getting everybody involved, but being aware of who has the power and the mandate, but realizing that often the legitimacy and the really interesting ideas about the future come from elsewhere. That is part of the network weaving approach that we will also get into later on. So learning point 2, getting that buy-in from the project commissioner, but going beyond that. The third learning insight is around the importance of the question and the design. Ask the right question, says Peter Drucker, not the right answer. This is the question around which the whole foresight project is then designed. And you really do need to probe, as we were saying. It's like, are we talking about, people will often come along saying, I want to know the future of cars, for example, but actually it might be about reframing the projects and saying it's about the future of mobility, because let's say a very famous Dutch company, DSM, was working in chemicals and plastics, and decided under the leadership of CEO Sibejma about 10 years ago to actually move and work on nutrition instead, and now does fantastic work with the UN in Rwanda, working with women farmers. And so, are you a company that is looking at the future of plastics? That could have been the question. Or are you a company that uses your technological skills and desire to create change and profit in the world to actually rethink how you might contribute? So that was, that's the real interesting question, and working with senior leaders to take them on that journey is really powerful. So to obtain that focal question, you often really need to kind of engage in a dialectic dialogue. And I saw that there was question about the different tools that you can use. Yes, interviews are very important. Surveys are very useful to kind of scan across the organization what they think. And we'll get into a couple more tools in a second. But really, the power of great questions cannot be understated, because very often what you're doing is challenging, and as Jim Data said, challenging present assumptions. Jim Data's great quote, the second law of the future: any useful idea or any idea about the future that is useful has to be ridiculous. And it's a very powerful statement to say that what you're doing is you're challenging the status quo and assumptions in a way that people often react quite like defensively. So in order to get especially busy senior leaders to start moving into that space, there's something about trust building, and a tool that's very helpful for that is the Shell Scenarios 7 questions. And you actually saw a couple of examples of that in that simulated case study that we just had, which was, firstly, there's the Oracle question, which is, if you were able to ask the Oracle at Delphi a question, what would that be? So if you really wanted to know something about the future, what is that thing that you'd really want to know? That really is a very helpful way of getting interesting insights. The other, another question from the 7 questions is the legacy question, which I asked at the end of the interview as well. So really, you know, this process of coming up with the right question cannot be understated, underplayed, how important it is in moving people together and weaving them on what that question is that genuinely opens up Horizon 3. So here's a kind of an example. It's not perfect at all, far from it, of a scoping question that is really nice. And because good scoping questions, what makes it great, for example, in the Afritania example that we did, or with the Tonga example that we just discussed, was it connects to the potential and the vehicle for change. So it's really kind of tangible. It scopes things clearly, so you're not boiling the ocean, and it genuinely opens up into Horizon 3. So here is an example of a scoping question done with, I think it was Kaistal Stepi from South Korea, where you'll see the context is quite well set. It's clear, it's about 30 years. It's clear the regional dimension, the scope around this, and also clear that you want to kind of see some of the wider issues. So the context is set, the question is outlined with a focus on international and multilateral institutions, and it's quite clear about the purpose and the outcome and who in particular to prioritize and engage. Now, learning point 4 is about designing your project to the context, adapting your approach and methods and tools and engagement to maximize impact. This we could spend another 2 weeks exploring, and I'm certainly hoping that over the course of the next weeks, we are going to be introducing interesting foresight methods from around the world. There is no ideal tool to use, but what is important is that the tool is always selected depending on what you're doing, how many resources you're having, and in particular, who you've got in the room. So I guess I've got kind of 2 key points to make on that. You know, you should always tailor your approach to the question. And we will absolutely, when we're going into the ordering phase and the implication phase, we will get into the different kinds of tools that are appropriate for different kinds of situations and different kinds of questions and methods and audiences. But, you know, this Popper diamond is quite an interesting way of just saying there are loads of different foresight methods out there, from highly creative to very kind of evidence based, highly participative to much more expertise based. You can use theatre, you can work with Delphi's if you're engaging with academic inputs. But in particular, I think there is, and this is a very fertile space because, and I'm going to ask Ruth to put the next generation of foresight practitioners link in. What I'm particularly proud of is seeing a great community of foresight enabled activists and change makers, young people from around the world who are using and developing their own futures approaches that are relevant to their own communities, and methodologies and language and ways of seeing time, which is so different. So we are hopefully over the next, and very much aided by the UN's focus on this, we are seeing and have been seeing for the past 5 years, and this will only accelerate, a huge diversification of the kinds of foresight methods that reflect the indigenous and local perspectives of many different communities around the world. And something that I'm particularly proud of, the practice that we've got in SWAF is how much effort they do to kind of support this methodological innovation. And Pratt, one of the NGFP winners from a few years ago, is actually beginning, and who many of you will know because she's then gone on to work with UNDP in Asia and is now doing brilliant work with Cambodia and many others. She's collecting a directory of different methods and to really understand and support, bring them to the fore. So there are lots of different methods to play with and apply depending on the context. But first of all is don't replicate stuff that's gone before just because it worked, and always, you know, think carefully about why you're using those approaches. It's remarkable how much this, you know, certain people just always use the same approaches as consultants. So when you're thinking about who to bring in and help you and advise you on this work, be very, you know, I would, you know, always ensure that they have a kind of heterodox and diverse methods, or you're very clear that you want that particular kind of approach. The second key message is that, you know, always explain why you're using this to the client. Don't necessarily assume any kind of prior knowledge of that. Just getting them to buy into those different approaches and the pros and cons is really important. So that part of kind of working with your senior lead or with your team to kind of really embed that understanding of why that's the right set of approaches. And there's normally lots of different approaches and tools that you'll use. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Taking quite a playful approach to it will be quite important as well. And then this final point I'm going to make around building external relationships into a sensing network. It helps you to challenge your thinking. It's the basis of your coalition for change when you're creating systems change, either in your sector or in your country or in your community. And very often when you've got your horizon scanning processes up, they can really help you. Those horizon 3 actors can really help inform the horizon scanning processes that you set up. So finally, that's the final point. I haven't actually really emphasized that because this is something that you will we'll get into later on in the scanning stages. So, and then you kind of put a bow on that with the scoping note, which is the document that really sets out the principal project parameters at the end of this, you know, a quarter to a third of your time really understanding and getting into it. As we had in the discussion, it's really critical to then soft contract and have the different participants kind of sign up to that and understand what you're actually doing, the scope of the note, the work, the time horizon. Otherwise, you do iterate backwards and forwards. So it's incredibly important for doing that in my experience, it's the most important thing to do, and it will absolutely pay dividends in the rest of your work together, in terms of being able to then integrate, and then in terms of being able to measure the success that you've had and be able to tell the story of how far people have come together through the foresight work that you've done. So it's really important. So you've got everybody on the same page, referring to more or less kind of having a little bit of a similar vocabulary to describe what you're collectively doing. And also it's a way for you to kind of see how far people have come. So at this stage, I think we are going to have a bit of a break before we get on to the scoping circle and get into a tool and how you might want to apply it on your live challenge. But let me just stop there and hand back over to Marius to check that we're actually both on time and that this is exactly the time that we're supposed to be going on a break.
Thank you for that energetic presentation, Kat. Quite correct, colleagues. We've got not a long break, just a leg stretch. So you may want to get a glass of water or stretch your legs, get a bit of oxygen to the brain. So we're going to give you 4 minutes here until 20 past, if that's okay. And then we're going to come right back and apply the scoping note. We're going to keep the room open, so don't be too long. We'll see you back in about 4 minutes' time.